Welcome to the Austin Public Library Reading for Life podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here today with friends to talk about the book, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. The purpose of Reading for Life is to grow community around a shared love of literature. Real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. With me today is my co-host, Michael Verde, who founded Reading for Life in 2005, and we're also joined today by several staff from the Southeastern Libraries cooperating here in Minnesota. Steve Harson is the Public Library Consultant, Pam O'Hara is Director of Outreach and Instruction, and Claire Hines is the Legacy Coordinator. Thanks everybody for being here with me today. I am super excited to talk about this book. I've been wanting to talk about this with people for a long time. I'll start a little bit with why I love this book. I didn't start out loving this book. I actually read The Left Hand of Darkness in college for a class, and I hated it. I remember just being annoyed with the whole thing in general. Maybe that was my stage of life. I don't know. But I do remember complaining to my professor about it and really not liking it. And then, ironically, 3 or 4 years later, when I was working on a master's degree and I was a teaching aide and having to teach I think it was a communications class. I had to pick a novel to discuss, and this was the one I picked. And I remember reaching out to my professor from my undergrad and being like, "You'll never guess what I just did," And because there's so much to talk about in this book, and that was kind of what I was looking for at the time. And then I've read it a couple times since, and every time I read it, I get something different out of it. So I am really excited to see what you guys thought, if you loved it or hated it, if it was your first read through, or if you've heard of Ursula Le Guin before. I think one of the interesting things about this book is that it was written in 1969, and it is still really, really relevant, I think, to current events so many years later. So that was kind of my introduction to Ursula Le Guin. Anybody else?
Well,
I have always,
Julie,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. I've always wanted to read an Ursula Le Guin book. It's always back there, but I never knew what to start with. So this was a really great way for me to just dive in. And I have to say, I didn't love it. I listened to the audio version of it, which I liked because I was driving while I was listening and taking it all in. But there were a lot of themes that we could talk about in there that, like you said, I do think is still relevant today. I mean, the politics and other things was really interesting. I always have a hard time with some, is this fantasy?
Science fiction.
The science fiction, when they have a bunch of names that I'm not sure how to pronounce, and that so I was glad I was listening to the audio of it because I didn't have to come up with my own pronunciation.
Audiobooks are always really handy like that.
Yes. So
Steve,
go ahead,
what were
Steve.
you going to say?
Well, Julie, I'm kind of like you were the first time you read it. I hated this book. and that does happen. And I was so glad that you said that you started there and that you got through it. The way I dealt with that was I started asking some questions of Chat GPT. Help me understand Ursula Le Guin's motivations for writing this book and some things like that. And in doing that, I understood the book in a very different way. And I think I can now go back and reread it because I did it as an audiobook. I can redo the audiobook. And I might come away with a different kind of a feeling.
Now, remind me, did the audiobook have the author's note at the beginning?
Yes,
or the introduction? It did. Okay.
It did.
Yeah.
The thing that I think working through the Chat GPT and how it analyzes the book that I take away from it that is not really expressed anywhere and not really expressed by Chat GPT is that this is also a work of anthropology, cultural relativism, which is a little bit of a challenging concept for people, meaning that every culture has its own validity and you have to work from within that culture to understand it. And also that this is a work, and ChatGPT didn't say this either, but it's also a road trip book, kind of on the model of Cormac McCarthy, and thinking about this book that way changes my perspective on it a little bit.
Claire, how about you? What was your kind of take on this book?
Yeah, I first read this book when I was an undergrad, and unlike most of you, I absolutely loved it. I was taking women and science fiction and gender studies course, and I can't think of a more perfect book. I think what I liked the most was the discussion it sparked amongst my classmates, and just the things that got me thinking about. It's very much a thought experiment, and I'm a huge fan of the author, and I have read all of her books and I love them. It's definitely not the one I would recommend that you start out with. So Pam, don't write her off completely.
No, I wouldn't. I would still read some more. So give me a list.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, I just think it's fascinating. I find it hard to believe that this book was published when it was, that it became so popular. It's really the book that launched her career as we know it today. And so I mentioned that to Julie, and she said, great, come on the podcast. And I was going to listen to the audiobook, but I got started and I just really couldn't get on board with the narrator. So I have my own way of pronouncing everything, and it's probably all wrong. But and it's been a while. But I did skim back through the book just to refresh my memory.
Great. Michael, how about you? What was your like initial take? Had you read this book before?
Well, first let me say the pronunciation thing is a issue in my life, irrespective of a science fiction novel. I grew up in East Texas, and a lot of words I only learned through reading. And if you don't hear people using the words, you really could come out all over the place. So this, what you're dealing with in this circumscribed space, my heart doesn't go out to you very far because I've lived with this affliction. I would propose that we start with what speaking of words that are difficult to pronounce, the Handra, and what ignorant means to the Handra, because I think it's a good way to start talking about fiction. For some reason, and it's there's nothing ill intention here, but often, as we've done, when we start to talk about works of literature in a book club context, in my experience, whether I like it or don't like it, is one of the first things that people put on the table. And there's nothing wrong with that. We do that for everything. Did you like Vegas? I didn't like Vegas. It's, I guess, the way we learn each other's tastes, etc. But it's not a particularly helpful way to get into a novel, because what do you do with it? So what I want to do is take the Handara's advice here and say that for them to be ignorant is to ignore, and ignorant in this case is a valorizing term. In other words, to be ignorant is, in this sense, is not something. It's a movement towards understanding as opposed to the opposite. So ignorant in the Handara sense is to ignore the abstraction and to hold fast to the thing. So let's just put that on the table for fun. And since we've mentioned gender, I'll finish the paragraph. There was in this attitude something feminine, a refusal of the abstract, the ideal, a submissiveness to the given, which rather displeased me. Now, the narrator here is generally I. So why don't we just, for fun, jump into that? Why is it important to the Handara for their spirituality to be ignorant in this sense of enlightened, to ignore the abstraction and to hold fast to the thing? And since we have put on the table just the very idea of fiction and just the fact that we're reading fiction, what that maxim, to ignore the abstraction and to hold fast to the thing, has to do with fiction. And so I've got a couple of things here, but all launch from the idea that there is a kind of esteemable ignorance that comes from ignoring the abstraction, holding fast to the thing, and then the further insight here, at least generally I's observation, that this is something feminine, a refusal to the abstract, the ideal, a submissiveness to the given, and then we can leave it why that displeased generally I for a supposed later discussion. So how about that? Somebody for whom all of that, what I just said, sparks some kind of idea.
Don't they say something in there too about it's their unlearning?
This is the same. We got two different kinds
thing.
of religion. No, I don't know it's the same thing, but this is coming from the Handra, which is related to Karhide, right? So that kind of unlearning that you're talking about is part of the Karhide spirituality. So I think that's a important insight. Well, let me just propose that this has something to do with the part and the whole, which would be one, I would think, of the central motifs. In fact, you might think of it as the concept, but it's not only a concept, it's just a schema of part and the whole that is at the very heart of this book's vision. So, for instance, an abstraction we could imagine as being a summation of the whole with inattentiveness to the parts. In other words, we're going to generalize, then we arrive at an abstraction that makes the particulars disappear. I'm trying to get at a kind of vision that causes one to be to miss it, to be ignorant in the negative sense, and that would be to miss the particulars because of the degree of your abstractions. And what generally Oz is suggesting here is that women are less vulnerable to this affliction than men, that women are more apt to be attentive to the particulars, to the things in themselves, than men are. The part in the whole here can't be evaded. Okay, I'm just trying to come at the part in the whole concept from a little bit of an oblique way, getting the part in the whole right. So if you imagine a contrast between the Karhide, I don't know if they're a nation or a Karhide civilization or whatever you want to think of it, versus the Orgorian. One difference is that Karhide seemed to be very feudal, which is to say there's a great degree of decentralization among the sources of power, or in other words, there's a degree of individuality that is not centralized. Whereas for the Orgorian, there is almost total centralization. So in terms of parts in the whole, you could say that in Karhide, the parts are autonomous or have a high degree of autonomy at the cost of perhaps the whole. Whereas for their opposite, it's the other way around. There is a maximum degree of centralization with almost a total effacement of individual autonomy.
So you're saying it's the US versus China.
Well, I didn't say that, but I do think that this concept of getting the parts in the whole right and what happens if you miss it. In other words, we can imagine as these two potential, let's just call them countries, for lack of a better term, have come out on opposite sides of the part and whole dynamic. And that's one of the things I think is being contrasted. And the whole point about abstractions and the particular things is that abstractions are a way of seeing the whole without attending to the parts. In other words, if we say that Moby Dick is about a whale, that's a degree of generalization that is absolutely true and almost absolutely useless at the same time. And this relates to fiction in a way. how is it that fiction enables us to pierce through generalizations that are ultimately ideologically manipulative? If you see what I mean, make America great again. That says everything and nothing. If you try to say, well, when was America great again? Then you start to get into some interesting kinds of things that the generalization evades. So that there's a really, I'm really talking about parts and wholes and just connecting the degree of abstractions versus particularities. For example, Flannery O'Connor said that fiction is all about putting dusty slippers on people's feet. And it was a way of saying fiction is really not about metaphysical points the way you might think a philosophy class is. Fiction writers aren't trying to make grand generalizations about the meaning of life. They're trying to put slippers on feet, particular people in a particular kitchen, if you see what I mean. They're moving towards particularity. And apparently, there is something crucial to our mental health and our imaginative health about not losing traction from particularities.
I actually think that if you dive too deeply into the particularities on this book, you can get lost in the weeds. I think that, she's not trying to tell us what a perfect government should look like. These two nations, they both have issues. Neither is perfect. Centralized, decentralized, east, west. She was writing this during the Cold War. Of course, she was pulling, from her personal experience and the socio-political environment that was going on. But to me, what resonates more in this book is all the dualities that we have. We have these two nations that are opposite, and they each have their own religion. We have the Yameshta, which is the Orgorian religion, and then the one that you were mentioning, Michael, that I can't remember off the top of my head. And they also have very different approaches, right? Reject knowledge and understanding, find peace through ignorance, and darkness, right? We have dark and light, we have male, female. They show up over and over and over again. We have the alien and the native, and the way that she juxtaposes these things to sort of reveal that none of us are right. We're all, living in this world where we have an opposite, but we're so entrenched in our own viewpoints that we can't connect.
Well, and she shows that too, I think, in kind of what Michael was saying, in the sense that neither country can figure out what to do with Genly, and they both miss the boat. And Estroven is trying, he starts out trying to help one, and then he shifts to try and help the other, and then they end up having to shift back again because they're almost extremes, and they're trying to figure out how do you find that balance between the two.
Yeah, and so much of that. Oh, go ahead,
Claire. I think you're exactly right that if you spend too much time digging into the weeds here, you miss the point of the book. However, we do have to acknowledge that Le Guin went to great effort to make up words and use things in particular ways, so those words do have meaning. And so, just as an example, let's talk about Carhide and Orgorian. What do those words mean? What was it she was trying to hide behind those words? And so I just take a really superficial level look at those words. What's car hide? Does it hide a car? Is that a garage? Is that a symbol of American capitalism and every man has his car? Versus Orgorian, which is that a good Ruski name?
yep.
And I honestly feel like she was using, whether consciously or not, this duality that you mentioned of capitalism versus communism that was such a huge cultural theme in those times. And I can remember those times, a little old here. but I think that she was using those words purposefully, even the words that she made up to represent something. And then we talk about Jen Lee AI. Does that have any meaning to us today? And is this really some sort of a treatise on treating things that are asexual or bisexual or however you want to describe it, AI? And then how are these two systems going to deal with that? I think there could be a piece there for us to consider.
Well, let me propose that the weeds in literature are words. So to get into the weeds in literature is to actually read literature. I think it's very important that there's the weed. To get into the weeds is a metaphor. The weeds in literature are words. So if we don't get into the words, we're going to project whatever sort of things are going on in our head onto the novel. So I don't think this is a issue of reading too deeply. I think you could project things that are a reflection of your own ego and make the book sort of, echo whatever's going on in your imagination. I could imagine that, but I think that the corrective to that propensity is to pay attention to the words. So if we take generally I, one thing we could do is we could hypothesize why that last name. Certainly, if you're one of your two protagonists, the name of your one or two protagonists is not going to be incidental. But we could also just turn that into the book and ask, what does the book say about this name? So, for instance, in Carhide, I read that people cannot pronounce I or conceive of I.
I thought it was the L.
Yeah, but Genley, Genry.
The I part, doesn't
is
it say they can't say I? They can't think of I? Carhides can't say I think it's on 32, unless I misread it.
I think it was that they couldn't say the L, so they called him Jenry instead of Jen Lee.
Oh, that's a big difference. Yeah, okay. That's a big difference.
Yeah, they can't say the L, so they call him.
That would be an example of not reading carefully. Not read. That's the opposite of getting in the weeds. That's not reading carefully. But I think we should stick with the I just because of the particular passage where they talk about I and thou. This one don't want to let go of the I. And this has to do with, Claire, your point about dualities and dichotomies. The I and thou notion, I don't know if she's being inspired by Buber. We don't need to go outside of the novel to come to terms with that. But is it possible for there to be an I and a thou that is not either one above the other? In other words, can we have when two people come together, what is going to be the nature of the relationship? Is it going to be one is dominant and the other is subordinate, which you could think of in terms of gender, maybe even in our own context, all the binaries, male and female, and then one is privileged. So in a patriarchal society, male would be privileged over female. What about homosexual and heterosexual? In other words, if we look at the dualities that Claire mentioned, I think implicit in that is when two opposites or contraries, or however we want to think it, come together, what is going to be the outcome of the relationship? How are these two beings that we can imagine need each other, if only for biological survival? How are they going to be combined in a way that doesn't lead to one or the other's diminishment? So in other words, all the dualities of the book, I think, are putting this on the table. How do we bring these together? And I just gave the example of those two different nations because I think they've arrived at solutions that are not optimal. And I'm not sure that we're supposed to say that there is an optimal one, except the novel does suggest that with the coming of the ecumen and the integration of Winter or Gethin into this larger unit, which was described, I think, as not so much the body politic as the body mystic. Isn't this how the ecumen is described? Well, that's a very interesting part of the book that I think we don't want to let go of. And I think it relates back to this abstractions.
And Michael, I think what you've just outlined is actually a neat synopsis of what is cultural relativism. How do two cultures meet without diminishing one of them, meet each other equally?
Well, that's a wonderful. I think that's a. I think that's I think that's a question that the book implicitly raises. That's why I think it's such a wonderful. And what language would they speak if we're imagining that cultures have, and to some extent, homogenous. They're not necessarily closed, but they certainly are to a certain degree self-sufficient if they have their own mythology, etc. If two cultures that are to a certain degree self-sufficient combine, is there a common language? Is there a common way? So I think that's implicit in this novel too. If you've got the envoy who's an alien, and let's say Estraven, is there a way that they can combine without one or the other being diminished?
And I thought that was shown really well in their friendship and their development of that friendship and their journey. And I thought that really showed how they both were like the other when whoever they encountered, and it was really I liked that development and how they became friends, even though they had a lot of opposites.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the crux of Genly's struggle throughout the whole book, why he's bouncing back and forth between these countries and he can't seem to trust anyone and he can't figure out what's going on, is because his mindset is so different and he's so rooted in these hierarchies, this gender hierarchy that he's used to back home. And just behaviorally, things are so different. He is inadvertently insulting people left and right because he's, doesn't know the customs, which is sort of ironic for someone who's supposed to be, an ambassador trained in making contact with other civilizations. But this is why, that's the whole reason he goes on this journey in the first place. Is that disconnect, that lack of a lack of a common understanding.
And how often their communication is misinterpreted throughout, from his conversations with Estraven, or however you pronounced it, Michael, or his conversations with the king at the beginning, and then again at the end, where they were still kind of, they're constantly missing each other, which I think happens all the time even now. So you can imagine how that would be if you were coming at it from a completely different language, and there are different, everything was so different.
With regards to development, a question we could ask is, does Genly I develop? And I think I get the feeling that he does. And in what way does Genly I develop? In other words, if there was a movement from a lesser degree of consciousness to a greater degree of consciousness, what was it? What was the insight? What was the experience? In literature, the term is agnoresis, or when the main character has a moment of recognition. Or you could think of it as an epiphany. Almost all works of fiction turn on a character having an insight that detonates a previous identity and enables him, therefore, to move into a more expansive, no pun intended, I. So if that's the case, I think a great question would be, what constitute Genly's I's expansion of consciousness? What affected that sort of transformation? I know there at the end of the novel, when the people from the Ecumen land, Genly I's observation suggested that they were alien to him now.
Well, and the irony of the very end of Estraven's son asking Genly I to tell him about him. So then you have Genly having to, describe and explain and tell the story of Estraven to his own son.
That's wonderful, isn't it?
Before we get too far away from it, I think we should talk a little bit about Ursula Le Guin and her parents. So her father was Alfred Kroeber, and her mother was Theodora Kroeber. they were very famous anthropologists. Anybody who takes a course in cultural anthropology is going to study them. And they were the proponents of cultural relativism. And what we're talking about here all is exercise in cultural relativism, that every culture should be measured on its own merits, that every culture has value, has order, has reason, has meaning, considered from its own context. And I think that this work is a work of culturally relativistic science fiction. And understanding it that way helps us get to all the points that all of you are making, and understanding that for Ursula Le Guin, this was her life. She was raised with this. This was how she sees the world. And in a sense, this book becomes her translation for the way she sees and views the world and measures the world. And that helped me to understand that, to frame the book a little bit better.
I can't help but wonder if it annoyed her parents that she took their work and turned it on a made up society, a made up culture.
I can imagine that they were probably thrilled.
Maybe.
Mhm.
Well, I think also, apologies, there's a lawnmower right outside, but I think that what's so interesting is that she's using cultural relativism to take a step back and introduce the concept of the gender non-binary in a
Yes.
way that won't immediately alienate the reader, because it's set, and that's where sci-fi becomes a great tool to explore these topics without, causing divisiveness. So she's taking this context that she already understands, and she's using it as a lens to explore this idea in a way that people will hopefully understand and begin to relate to, because she's doing it through the eyes of someone from Terra, which is clearly Earth, who's coming from a society with a strong gender binary.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very brilliant. It really, she's just, yeah, incredible.
I'm really with you, Claire. I think you're on it right there.
Do you think at the end of the novel that the final vision would be there is Korhide, there's Argorian, there is Terra, and that each of these different, let's say, uh, bodies of people are equally aptly oriented to consciousness? In other words, is there between these different mentalities, let's call it, is it impermeable, or does the ending of the novel suggest that there is a way of being human that's inclusive of this diversity that is not, however, relativistic? This brings us back to the parts in the whole. If everything is relativistic, then every part is discrete. And there really isn't a whole. There is only every autonomous atom that is self sufficient. It's a monad. That would be a way to imagine relativism as complete relativism. Everything is self sufficient. Whether you think of that as at an individual level, a family level, whatever level, this unit is self sufficient. Or does the novel suggest that there is a unity that does not violate the integrity of the part, but that nevertheless is greater than the sum of all the parts? And I'm leaning into this because I think the novel leans into this at virtually every page. Is there a unity that doesn't take away the uniqueness, the particularity of the part?
I tend to agree with you, Michael, and it brings me to think, is the overall theme here a very late 60s theme? Peace, brother. give peace a chance. Let's just understand everybody. Everybody has a valid perspective here. Is her novel really part of that 1960s peace movement?
Well, I don't think that. I mean, just going back to Pam's point about development. If Jin Lee I has developed, then there is a implicit critique of the frame of reference that Jin Lee I brought to Winter. In other words, Jin Lee I landed, there was a constricted degree of consciousness that at the end of the novel was no longer, let's say, that he was liberated from the consciousness that he landed on Winter with. And if that's the case, there's something not relativistic. I mean, there's an implicit, if a person's moved from point A to a greater degree of consciousness of point B, then there's a critique of point A, which means it's not relativistic. Generally, I landed with a particular frame of reference, which I think to make Claire's point, is a pretty lacerating critique of the limitations of patriarchy or of the domination of one half of our being by the other half. If everything feminine is subordinate to everything masculine. And I think this is partly why Genly I could not understand that his only true friend was Estraven or Estraven. In other words, Genly I could not understand the consciousness of Estraven, and Estraven wasn't afflicted with this dichotomous relationship to his own being. I mean, there was a unity with Estraven that Genly I didn't have, and Genly I therefore was misreading what is an effect, I think, a more integrated consciousness.
But does that kind of go along with what you're saying, that the ecumen was kind of the whole and Genly I was a part even of the whole, and so he was flawed, and he learned something from Winter, from all of the things that he experienced, which is part of what the ecumen is doing by pulling in all of these other worlds and saying, we don't want to fight, we just want to exchange information for the greater good. So is that part of kind of what you're saying, that the ecumen is kind of the whole and maybe the ideal, but even Genly coming from the ecumen was still flawed as an individual part and had to take in some new things to learn to become closer to the whole?
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, that any individual part would not have the vision without participating in a consciousness that was greater. But I am, just for the sake of conversation, making a distinction between the 60s kumbaya,
Sure,
where everybody's right in their own regards and there's no critique. We just get together and everybody's equally right, versus the notion that there is something that can unite us in a way that this everybody is autonomous doesn't. If you see what I mean, that there's a way we can be a whole without any of our diversity being compromised. That, I think, is what's this question being, I mean, the possibility being raised here. Is there a way that we can be a whole that, let's say in this case, that the feminine is not subordinate to the masculine? Or do we have to say, well, it's going to be the other way around? The feminine is going to be dominant. Go ahead.
I also wonder if that's a little bit a critique of the construct of gender, or really the critique of a construct just in general, in that if you are raised with a particular construct, no matter how much you are shown the logic of a world in which that construct doesn't exist, you still carry that with you. You still do.
Well,
It's
that's
really
wonderful.
hard to put that aside.
I think now we're getting somewhere that's really, really interesting. I mean, I think that we could say Genly I arrives at Winter with an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the novel has been liberated from an ideology. And I think maybe Claire's point, implicitly or explicitly, is that is a profound reading on our own ideological sort of constrictedness. In other words, our own way of making sense of reality is constantly undermining our own consciousness. In other words, we are ourselves imprisoned with the frame of reference that Genly I arrived at Winter with. And we could imagine that this novel, or even the contribution that fiction makes, is that it might be one means to liberate us from what you just said, that we've internalized these constructions so deeply that we can't see them. I mean, we're so deeply into the picture that we can't see outside of it. So, is it the case that a work of fiction like this enables us to imaginatively step out of the frame, look back on the ideology that was too much with us, and start to realize how really we're half human in some profound sense? We are lamed human at the level of consciousness. That's what I'm just sort of throwing out there. And I'm sorry that I added the abstraction stuff too quickly. And that sort of messed us up a little bit. But one of the what I think is important about that is I don't think we get to the insights that enable us to see beyond our ideological constructions if we stick with abstractions. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, that abstractions actually keep us blind to our own ideological deficiencies. We got to get, in some sense, to the particular. And I think the novel illustrates this with, when does Genly I and Estraven, and particularly Genly I, start to understand Estraven in a way that he hadn't heretofore. And that's when they get into that journey back home that's so physically taxing, and the landscape is so utterly bleak, that he begins to see Estraven less as a political animal or less in a social context, and more as just a being like himself trying to survive. In other words, the abstractions start to disappear, is what I'm suggesting, on their journey home. And that it's breaking out of his abstractions that enabled him to have an intimacy with Estraven. I hope this is not just too abstract, but there's a reason why they start to understand. Why is it generally I starts to see Estraven in a new way, in an absolutely barren context where their survival is at stake? I'm suggesting that that is a way of getting through abstractions and getting down to the primary concerns of our very life that enables us to get out of our ideologies. Does that make any sense?
I I think that that gets right to the heart of what the novel is about.
And I think it's this theme has come up in multiples of the novels we've talked about, right? It's the whole idea of, why are artists the first to be attacked in a society when things are threatened? And it's that whole idea that fiction can liberate you from those social constructs, right? That's what makes artists dangerous in a lot of places where people don't want anyone to look at the social construct, because it's keeping the hierarchy the way they want it.
Or libraries dangerous.
Or libraries dangerous. Yeah, right. Which is what we're experiencing right now in the world.
Right.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? Really, isn't that? I mean, without getting into the politics too deeply, just to say the kind of attention that is turning towards education would be an indication that we're in a degree of ideological warfare to a certain extent, where people understand that the imagination is the ultimate source of one or the other side prevailing. That who can dominate the imagination, as it's particularly transmitted to young people. This is almost where the Civil War, and again, it's not the point of this discussion to go too deeply, but it is, I think, important to point out what you just said, that the imagination is ultimately the thing that could liberate one from a kind of domination. I mean, why is Plato worried about the poet, or why does any dictator worry about the poet, when you would think if someone sitting in a coffee shop trotting out poems would be as you just said, why would that be threatening to the state? So anyway, so I want to come back to this abstraction here. The imagination I'm going to propose does not work with abstractions. The imagination works with images, and all images are particular. I'm sorry it took me to go around Aunt Rhody's house to get here. But the point I would try to make is the imagination doesn't know anything about abstractions. The imagination does not abstract, if you see what I mean. The intellect might abstract. The imagination is, Blake would say, the imagination traffics in minute particulars. and the ego traffics in generalizations. And I think it's those minute particulars, once we start to engage with them, that enables us to get out of our own ideological sort of blinders. You see what I mean? If I don't see you, Julie, in your absolute minute particular, if you're always just a woman to me, or if you're always just a librarian, if you're always just a thing, and isn't this what's going on in Orgorian? They can't see the thing until they've classified it. I mean, that's a very explicit thing. They don't encounter the thing until they've labeled it. And I'm suggesting that that is not how the imagination interacts. The imagination would not just see you as a woman. The imagination would encounter you and your uniqueness. So yes, that's a way to think of you, but that doesn't exhaust your identity. So this is really why we're sitting with the abstraction, that the imagination refuses to see things as generalizations, which I think is what can liberate us from, when generally I did not see Estraven as a thing and began to encounter Estraven in all of its unique particularities. Doesn't he say that? It's when I began that I couldn't accept you when you were a man and a woman. It's almost saying that I came here with categories that incapacitated me from being intimate with you. That's where I was trying to go with all that.
It's interesting too, because I actually experienced that this time reading the book. I realized about halfway through the book that I was very thrown by the fact that she uses the pronoun he so much with the people of winter. And at some point I was like, I'm having a hard time connecting with the story this time. And I think it was because I identify as a woman and there were not any women in the story. And so, and then as they started talking about that, I was like, it was almost like I was experiencing what Genly was experiencing in a sense, because of the pronoun that was being used. And I was made aware of that because they actually bring it up. I think I had read at the beginning, they talk about it in the introduction about why she did what she did. And,
Yes.
And because I'm very aware of pronouns in this day and age, it made me think. I caught on to that at some point. I was like, wow, I understand what he's experiencing it, because I'm experiencing it too. Like, I feel this detachment from the story because there are no women. And when and when anyone shows any kind of femininity, he like really degrades them. He's always got this very negative, it's always in a negative connotation.
LeGuin does address that in that introduction.
Yeah.
That said, why did I use he? Well, the initial description said he, and then I just sort of was stuck with that, and I had to keep using it.
And would you say then that generally I is grown out of what you just said, Julie, at the end of the novel? In other words, that generally I was not bothered by the implicit.
I think by the end, he was at least aware.
Yeah, I would
think and at the end, he actually finds, when the spaceship comes down and all the clearly, gender coded people come off, he's disturbed by their appearance, presence.
Yeah, so that's the journey
Full
he
circle.
goes on.
Yeah,
for sure.
He has become trans.
Right? That's the kind of, like, if we're going to do a pre and post test, pre-test, these people were aliens. Post-test, we're aliens.
Yeah.
And I think Steve, you mentioned that too. I know there is that part in when they're crossing the ice and they talk about that they're both others in their own way, and that is why they connect eventually, because they are both outsiders in their own sense. And once Genly can get past the gender binary problem, then he starts to see that, and that is kind of when they start to connect.
And both those points are absolutely critical to understanding cultural relativism. Yeah. It's like, are these people alien? To I'm alien. Mm-hmm. And the point you just made, Julie.
I think that's really a powerful thing to meditate on, right? You can imagine young people who are in high school are working with all kinds of labels and categories. Their identities. What is Facebook? But just a way, I mean, how much does marketing work by getting us to identify with an abstraction? I'm a millennial, or I'm a nerd, or I'm a whatever. And once we've identified with an abstraction, then we can become a source of a certain kind of marketing.
I should have asked you early when you first started talking, Michael, about abstractions. I should have asked you for particulars about what you were talking about. So you're talking about labels or things, ways that we use to generalize.
Yeah, and I used the word because the novel did, but I would say the pronoun he, for instance, is an abstraction.
Yeah.
This comes up a lot in my work with people with cognitive impairment, because often people imagine that people with cognitive impairment are a certain type of people. So they'll say about people with dementia, but what stage do they become aggressive? Now the implication is that there is a they there. You see what I'm saying? So the they then collapses all of the uniqueness of someone that may have a certain kind of neurological challenge, becomes a they, and then and then you can market that, because then you can be an expert on them. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but the big issue is, how does the imagination refuse to play that game? That's because this takes us back to the author's preface about she's using words to communicate things that words can't say. Why is it that I have to lie to tell the truth? I think it's getting to this right here, that words, if they are used as generalizations, are going to cause us to be half people. They're going to cause us to put ourselves into categories, and then we're going to have political warfare over which is to the dominant. But is there a way of using language that deconstructs language's in sort of intrinsic generalization, right? Language we have to speak in general to a certain extent to speak at all. So how does poems refuse to do that, if you see what I mean? How do poems refuse to do what a history book does? And why is that important if we want to liberate ourselves from the ideologies of history? And I'm suggesting that poetry is using words so that I quit seeing you just as Julie, the female librarian in Austin, Minnesota, and I could actually encounter you. It doesn't mean you're not those things. It just means you're not only those things.
I think a good term that might be helpful in terms of visualizing what you just said, Michael, is autistic. When we just used autistic to describe people, people were generalized and categorized and treated away. But when we switched to talking about being on the spectrum and discussed what being or neurodivergent and discussing like that there's a range of things that can be expressed with that changes the dynamic of what it means to be labeled with that term.
Well, wonderful. I think that's a wonderful way to think about what's the contribution to art, that it can enable us to get some distance on the categories that have blinded us to the uniqueness of the other. And I wouldn't even know what making love would mean if you were making love as two generalizations. And I'm not trying to be crass about it. I'm just trying to get to what the novel sort of moves towards, of a total union in which both people are fulfilled and both people are fulfilled, but they absolutely know each other in a kind of total knowing that would defy generalization. How can I mean, what is it about Meshi? What does he say? Is that your doings are my eyes and your knowing is my being? I mean, this, now when we take it, this Meshi, or this, whatever this transcendent divine thing is, that is also refusing to refusing to live in abstractions. If you see what I mean, if this is a God that is insisting that the body of the God are particular people. Now we're getting into stuff. This is Ursula Le Guin's relationship to Blake here. And one of the things that are going on is, how can all of these individual humans be remembered into a total? This is the body mystic now. And the distinction between the ecumen being a body politic and a body mystic, a body politic is going to be established on a dominant subordinate hierarchy. A body mystic is going to be a body in which there is no more domination and no more subordination. So how is it that we can be a community, and that we can be a genuine community? And I suspect that what this novel is sort of suggesting is, we can't be a real community until we become parts of each other's bodies, until who I am and who you are is so thoroughly integrated that I can't imagine my I without a thou. So I don't have an I without a thou. It would be like Jenny I saying, I don't have an I without Esterman. If you see what I mean. I don't have an I without the other, even including if the other is ultimately different. And isn't what that's what Genly I says, I think, about the love between Genly I and Esterman, is that the love was embedded in the difference. This could be a really practical thing if you're a high schooler and you look across the room and there is someone who's autistic, or if you look across the room and there is someone who's homosexual or transgender. If you imagine that until you experience some kind of mind speak with that homosexual person, you yourself will never be whole. I mean, I'm trying to get right down to the getting down right now. If you can't have mind speak with that autistic person, it's not simply that you're going to not understand that person. You're not going to understand yourself, because that person is a part of what makes you whole. I think the novel's bringing that, honestly, to tell you, with the distinction between the body mystic and the body politic and the mind speech at the end. If you can't mind speak with everyone, especially those who are the most different, you yourself are always going to be a kind of spiritual amputee. You will never know who you are, because part of who you are is in that other there, in the difference with the other.
And isn't that an amazingly different way to look at it, that you can never know yourself until you know the other? Like, wouldn't that change so much about so many things if that was...
I mean, I think this novel is bringing it right down to that point. And we can circle back to test this out. What about the foretellers? What about the scene of Fax the Weaver and that ensemble of foretellers? One was, I think, a pervert. There was pervert in there. There was someone who was insane. I think. I mean, let's just go back to that scene. Those are a web of people who, in some sense, were all misfits. Fax the Weavers in the nucleus, and the entire experience of asking and receiving an answer, which is to say, breaking through consciousness that can see the present so deeply that they're not really talking about the future. She says this in the beginning of the novel, that fiction writers are not prophets. I know you may know less about the future than you do. However, the imagination can be so deeply in communion with the present that it sometimes can see what is present now that will be present in the future. It's only prophetic because it's going to be present eternally. I'm going back to Fax the Weaver. How is it that those foretellers are achieving a degree of consciousness that really breaks through time? And why does that relate to Fax the Weaver integrating such diverse, as you said, non-typical? I mean, look at the foretellers. They were like, really, this was a group of divergent people with a center that somehow, okay, this is, I think, what we're talking about, the body mystic now. And it makes your sort of point that I need the other to even know who I am. This, yeah. I think this is what the novel is getting at here, and you could see why no political ideology, any body politic, is going to want to privilege one binary over the other. So if you have this imagination that refuses to play either game, okay, I'm not privileging the male, I'm not privileging the female. I'm privileging this thing called absolute total mutual knowing. If you see what I mean, I'm privileging I and thou. I'm privileging mind speak. I'm suggesting that fiction that mind speak is a symbol of fiction, is what I'm suggesting. And that's why it could never be entirely incorporated. And this makes, I think, Pam's point that insofar as the library is a kind of, let's say, habitation or domicile or the home of the imagination as it exists in verbal form, then the library is always going to be an outsider to any political ideology. The library is going to belong to no ideology, which is going to make it a traitor. And this is why I think Estraven is the traitor, right? I mean, we can think of Estraven as the artist, and the artist is always going to be a traitor to um, the political ideologue. The artist is always a traitor to the body politic, because the artist is faithful to something that the body politic cannot incorporate without deconstructing. If the body politic tried to incorporate the body mystic, it would deconstruct. If you see what I mean, it would be a degree of consciousness that this ideology simply cannot exist if you bring it that degree of consciousness to bear on it. You see what I mean? That ideologies require a constrictedness that the imagination refuses to be encapsulated by. And one of the ways that it refuses to be encapsulated is it will not play the abstract game. I want to see Julie in absolute particularity. No one could define you for me until we encounter. This is what this. I mean, this. I think we're getting to Ginley I and Estraven at the end of the novel. Something happens to them that was more intimate than sex. I mean, this is made pretty explicit. Something happens to them that was more intimate than sex, and I'm suggesting that deconstructs every ideology. That kind of wholeness simply will not be contained in what any other kind of ideology is trying to create. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think that kind of brings us around to, I mean, we're kind of getting short on time here, so that kind of brings us around though to a really good place. That was a really good start for this. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to this novel. And
absolutely, this is why it's so heralded,
right,
as one of the epitomes of what the genre can do.
Right.
So I think it definitely warrants us rereading it.
Yeah. But I really think it's interesting, and we luckily we have a few more conversations to do that. But I think that's a really interesting to think about, that idea of the mind speech is kind of how did you say it, that it's like the equivalent of fiction in the sense that that's the one thing that can kind of bring things together and give you that insight without
domination,
without domination. Yeah.
In fact, if we don't get together like the ecumen and talk, none of us are going. In other words, there's no pope here and there's no right answer. There's just us, like those four tellers. Okay. And we're contributing. And if we can internalize what each other is contributing, it's like that smorgasbord, or what do they call it? A buffet after church. We used to potluck. I don't know if you guys had that. We had potluck. So after church, everybody bring a dish, and then the whole church would have, and then you would pick. I think it's something like that we then are incorporating each other's imagination's contribution to consciousness. And then we're expanding into another way of seeing that it's not, as Steve pointed out, not so ideologically relative, not so relative to my family background or to my cultural background. I'm starting to achieve a kind of universality, but I want to stress the universality is not generalizations. That's the big thing here. That universal and the particular are wedded, and the opposite of both are generalizations. That's why I was started with the abstraction. That abstractions are not universal and they're not particular. You see, they is not universal and it's not particular. It's almost like there is no they. You couldn't find the actual. If you said, show me a man, you couldn't even show me a man, because you'd always put your finger on a particular person. If you see what I mean. If we start to believe there's such a thing as this abstraction, that is the beginning of a kind of idolatry that ultimately blinds us to each other's uniqueness. I will cease to be able to see you, Julie, because I'll see you through all the categories that were offered to me to make sense of another person. And this is the critique of the Orgorians. they don't know what something is until they've assigned it a label.
Mhm. Mhm.
So breaking out of that, I think, is what we see at the end of the novel. When Jinli I breaks out of the categories that he brought with him to Winter. And then for the first time has an encounter with Estervan. And speaking of words, that does seem to just say Raven, right? This is the Raven. I mean, Estervan, isn't that the Raven? Isn't that a Raven? I mean, so whatever the raven is symbolizing there is, I think, I don't know for sure, but raven is a black bird. So we got so much going on with dark, and he didn't pick raven for no particular reason. As a raven just symbolically mediates between the spiritual world and the material world. And I think Estraven is a kind of artist figure, and that's why he's necessarily a traitor. But ironically, because the artist is loyal to particularities and to the universal, and he's not loyal to generalizations, and that makes him a traitor to every ideology that needs abstractions. And I gave the example of, let's pick a neutral abstraction, but if you say America, let's just say whatever, you just throw out some slogan out there. That is an abstraction that ultimately you have to, what does that mean? And if you start to say what does it mean, it starts to disintegrate. If you say, hail how the motherland, or the great, what does that great mean? This is what the foretellers, right? You would always, if you ask the foretellers a question about which counselor would serve me best, wasn't the response from Fax the Weaver, well, that presumes that you would know what it meant to be served best.
Right. Because serving you best may be knocking you off so that someone else can take over.
Right. That's an example of an abstraction, serving you best.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? That's an abstraction. So until you can get to the absolute particular thing, you're always going to be ignorant of reality, because reality traffics in minute particulars. We will not know each other intimately if we can't encounter each other outside of our categories. That's really what I'm throwing that out there.
Good stuff.
This is powerful stuff. This is powerful stuff. This is Ursula Gwynn is not, she's played, if you read her just her writings, the authors that she's internalized, from Borges to Blake, this is a profound intelligence.
Yeah.
And then to have the gift of being able to communicate in a language that is not abstract. This is a work of fiction. So I could pick it up and not understand anything about these concepts and enjoy the story. So this is a very interesting, this is a profound mind that is not trafficking in abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the most intellectual people I have known in my life have been children of anthropologists. I'll just say that.
I can imagine why. I think that's I think that's a wonderful insight, Steve. That this is a tradition that she was coming from. That the participant observer is what the anthropologist. The anthropologist cannot just be an observer.
Mm-hmm.
For all the reasons that we just said. As long as you're an observer, your categories will be blinding you to these people until you participate into their life forms, which means until you get out of your terminology. You will not understand what this ritual means to these people if you think ritual means something in general. Unless you participate in this ritual with these people, you're not going to understand what ritual means to these people. If you see what I mean. That's a way of breaking out of abstraction. And that's why anthropologists have to be participant observers in a way that the biologist is. And the biologist can take a sample, a cellular sample from these people without integrating into their life forms. They can just, you know what I mean? You could just take a little sample and go back to the laboratory. An anthropologist cannot do that because it's entering into a realm of meaning that is always unique, as opposed to our biological thing that is at the species level. You see me? You see what I mean? Almost an individual you have to see the individual for more than just the species or more than just the gender. And I don't think you could do that without becoming intimate with that person. And it doesn't have to involve sex. As generally and Estraven, they did something apparently that was even deeper than sex. that broke out of all of Genly I's constructs.
Mhm.
I would just throw that out there.
All right. That was a great place to start. Lots there. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. And we will continue this conversation